He'd been talking to strangers on amateur radio for 12 years, operating from his basement setup, chatting with fellow hobbyists around the world about weather, equipment, and the simple pleasure of long-distance communication. Just another elderly ham radio enthusiast filling retirement hours, until a massive earthquake severed all commercial communications across the Pacific Northwest, and suddenly the quiet hobbyist became the only voice connecting emergency responders to the outside world. Walter Charles Hendricks was 79 years old, with thinning gray hair that stood at odd angles from running his hands through it while concentrating on technical problems, and sharp blue eyes that still focused clearly on oscilloscope displays and circuit diagrams despite his age. His weathered hands bore the permanent calluses of someone who had spent decades soldering connections, climbing antenna towers, and building communication systems that connected people across impossible distances. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this incredible tale of hidden expertise and life-saving communication, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories about quiet masters deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Walter's house sat on 2 acres in rural Oregon, 40 miles east of Portland, where property was affordable and amateur radio operators could install the antenna systems required for long-distance communication without homeowner association restrictions. His basement had been converted into what ham radio operators called a shack, the nerve center where sophisticated radio equipment connected him to fellow operators around the globe. The setup looked like mission control to visitors unfamiliar with amateur radio. Multiple transceivers covering different frequency bands, computer monitors displaying propagation data and digital communication protocols, and antenna analyzers that ensured optimal signal transmission. But to Walter, it was simply the workspace where he pursued the hobby that had given retirement its purpose and structure. Every morning at 6 a.m., Walter descended to his basement shack to participate in the Pacific Northwest Emergency Net, a daily gathering of amateur radio operators who practiced emergency communication procedures while sharing weather reports, equipment discussions, and the gentle camaraderie that connected people who understood the technical artistry of radio frequency communication. Good morning, this is Walter, W7WCH, checking into the net from Grid Square, CN85. Weather here is partly cloudy, temperature 42 degrees, winds light and variable. These daily check-ins represented more than hobby participation. They were practice sessions for the communication networks that amateur radio operators maintained as backup systems when commercial telecommunications failed during natural disasters, infrastructure attacks, or equipment failures that could isolate communities for days or weeks. The ham radio community treated Walter with the respect reserved for Elmers, experienced operators who mentored newcomers and maintained the technical standards that kept amateur radio functioning effectively. His expertise in antenna design was legendary among local operators. His knowledge of propagation theory helped others optimize their stations, and his patient teaching style had guided dozens of new operators through the licensing process. What none of them knew was that Walter's understanding of radio frequency communication extended far beyond amateur radio hobby applications. Walter lived alone since his wife Eleanor had passed 3 years earlier, finding comfort in the daily routines and technical challenges that amateur radio provided. The main floor of his house was comfortable but unremarkable, furnished with pieces that reflected practical priorities rather than decorative ambitions. But the basement shack told the story of someone whose relationship with radio communication had defined his professional life as well as his retirement interests. Mixed among the amateur radio equipment were instruments that exceeded hobby-level requirements, spectrum analyzers that cost more than most people's cars, signal generators with precision that supported commercial-grade testing, and antenna and reference standards used for calibrating broadcast and cellular communication systems. The wall display that most visitors assumed showed amateur radio achievements actually contained awards and certifications from a 43-year career in telecommunications engineering, patents for cellular tower design, recognition from the Federal Communications Commission for contributions to emergency communication protocols, and consulting agreements with telecommunications companies that had shaped how modern communication networks responded to disasters. Walter Charles Hendricks, the architect of much of the Pacific Northwest's telecommunications infrastructure. 43 years designing cellular networks, microwave communication links, and emergency backup systems that kept people connected during the kind of disasters that regularly affected the seismically active region where he'd spent his career. His specialty had been redundant communication systems, understanding how natural disasters affected electronic infrastructure, designing backup networks that could maintain connectivity when primary systems failed, and developing protocols that allowed different communication technologies to work together during emergencies. The career had taken Walter from early cellular network development through the Internet revolution, from analog systems that required mechanical switching to digital networks that could route traffic through satellite links when terrestrial infrastructure was compromised. His designs had kept Pacific Northwest communities connected during volcanic eruptions, ice storms, and the kind of seismic events that could sever fiber optic cables and topple cell towers across entire regions. Retirement in 2008 was voluntary rather than forced. Walter had accumulated enough years of service to retire with full pension while still being young enough to pursue technical interests that didn't involve the corporate pressures and deadlines that had characterized his professional career. The amateur radio hobby wasn't a substitute for professional telecommunication work. It was a return to the pure technical enjoyment that had attracted him to radio frequency engineering during childhood experiments with crystal radios and antenna construction. Building amateur radio stations, experimenting with digital communication protocols, and mentoring new operators provided the same intellectual satisfaction without the commercial constraints that had sometimes compromised elegant engineering solutions. But 43 years of designing communication networks for disaster scenarios doesn't disappear because someone changes from professional to amateur status. And Walter's expert eye continued monitoring the infrastructure vulnerabilities that could affect his community when natural forces overwhelmed human engineering. Tuesday, April 11th started like every other morning. Walter descended to his basement shack at 5:50 a.m., powered up his transceivers, and prepared to check in to the Pacific Northwest emergency net at the precise 6 a.m. start time that amateur radio operators maintained with military precision. This is W7NWX, Net Control Station for the Pacific Northwest Emergency Net. Good morning, and welcome to our daily emergency preparedness training. We'll begin with check-ins from our regular participants. Walter waited for his turn in the alphabetical rotation, using the time to review weather reports and propagation predictions that would affect radio communication throughout the day. At exactly 6:07 a.m., during Walter's routine check-in, everything changed. The 6.8 magnitude earthquake struck without warning, centered 40 miles southeast of Portland, with enough force to topple cell towers, sever fiber optic cables, and knock out electrical power across a region that housed over 2 million people. Walter's basement shack, built to withstand exactly these conditions, remained operational. His antenna systems, designed with earthquake-resistant guy wires and flexible mounting systems, continued functioning. His backup power systems, sized for extended emergency operation, automatically activated when commercial electricity failed. But most importantly, his amateur radio station remained connected to emergency networks that were designed to function when everything else failed. This is W7WCH, Emergency Traffic, Walter announced on the emergency frequency that amateur radio operators reserved for disaster communication. Major seismic event in progress. Commercial communications appeared to be down throughout the Portland metropolitan area. Within minutes, Walter's basement shack became the primary communication link between isolated emergency responders and the outside world.
But as reports came in from amateur radio operators throughout the affected region, Walter realized that this disaster exceeded anything the current emergency communication protocols were designed to handle. The earthquake had damaged infrastructure that Walter had personally designed to survive seismic events, which meant the backup systems that emergency responders expected to function were also compromised.
Walter Hendricks faced the choice that would define how effectively his community responded to the worst natural disaster in Pacific Northwest history. He could operate as a standard amateur radio emergency volunteer, relaying messages according to established protocols, while hoping that someone else would coordinate the technical solutions required for large-scale emergency communication. Or he could use 43 years of telecommunications engineering expertise to implement emergency communication networks that went far beyond amateur radio capabilities, drawing upon professional knowledge that could save lives if applied quickly enough. Walter made his decision in approximately 10 seconds. This is W7WCH coordinating emergency communications. He announced on frequencies that reached amateur radio operators, emergency services, and federal agencies simultaneously. I'm implementing enhanced emergency communication protocols. All stations stand by for technical coordination. The transformation was instantaneous. The amateur radio hobbyist disappeared, replaced by the telecommunications engineer who had spent 4 decades designing exactly these kinds of emergency response systems. Over the next 12 hours, Walter coordinated communication networks that connected isolated emergency responders with federal disaster assistance, established backup internet connectivity for hospitals whose fiber optic connections had been severed, and implemented satellite communication links that provided connectivity for communities that had been completely cut off from the outside world. His basement amateur radio station became the nerve center for emergency communication throughout the Pacific Northwest, handling everything from coordinating medical evacuations to routing federal emergency management communications. W7WCH, this is Emergency Management requesting status on Highway 26 corridor. Emergency Management, this is Walter Hendricks coordinating telecommunications. Highway 26 is passable with detours, but cellular coverage is non-existent between mile markers 12 and 47. I'm establishing amateur radio repeater stations to provide communication for emergency vehicles in that corridor. By 6 p.m., Walter had established temporary communication networks that restored connectivity for most essential services throughout the affected region. But the effort had revealed infrastructure vulnerabilities that exceeded what amateur radio emergency protocols were designed to address. Mr. Hendricks, this is Federal Emergency Management. We understand you've been coordinating emergency communications throughout the affected region. What's your background in telecommunications? Walter looked around his basement shack at the amateur radio equipment that had provided the foundation for emergency communication networks that were now handling federal disaster response coordination. FEMA, this is Walter Hendricks. I'm a retired telecommunications engineer, 43 years designing the infrastructure that failed today. But I'm also W7WCH, amateur radio operator, and these emergency communication networks are exactly what we trained for. The story made national news as an example of how amateur radio operators provided essential emergency communication during disasters, but most coverage focused on the volunteer spirit rather than the professional expertise that had made such coordination possible. Walter returned to his daily amateur radio routine, checking into the Pacific Northwest Emergency Net every morning at 6 a.m. and mentoring new operators in emergency communication procedures. But something had changed in how the amateur radio community and emergency services viewed their quiet colleague. Walter was invited to conduct emergency communication training for federal agencies, consulted on infrastructure improvements that would make future disasters less disruptive, and helped design amateur radio emergency networks that bridged hobby applications with professional-grade emergency response capabilities. Walter, how did you know how to coordinate such complex emergency communication networks? Asked Jake, a new amateur radio operator during one of Walter's training sessions. Walter looked up from the circuit diagram he was explaining, his sharp blue eyes holding the calm competence that had never quite disappeared. Jake, amateur radio emergency communication isn't separate from professional telecommunications. It's the backup system that takes over when the professional networks fail. Understanding both sides makes you more effective at either one. Walter Hendricks continued his amateur radio activities until he was 86 years old when health issues finally made basement operations impractical. He spent his final years training emergency communication specialists in techniques that combined amateur radio capabilities with professional telecommunication knowledge, because he'd learned that the most effective emergency response often required expertise that exceeded official training, dedication that continued regardless of job titles, and technical knowledge that served communities whether or not anyone realized the depth of experience behind simple call signs.